Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor back. Truly an epic show today. We have one of the most influential individuals in the modern nutritional discussion, a man who is the Jacob Gould Sherman Professor Emeritus of Nutritional Biochemistry at Cornell University. He's authored over 300 research papers, been doing this for decades, wrote what has got to be the most talked about nutrition-related book in the modern era, The China Study. His book, Whole, just came out. He was featured in the documentary Forks Over Knives, and he's also the founder of the T. Colin Campbell Foundation, which can be learned. You can learn more about that at tcolincampbell.org. And as you can guess by the name of his organization, we have none other than Dr. T. Colin Campbell joining us today. Dr. Campbell, welcome to the show.
That's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Campbell, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show today is your new book is titled Whole. And I love that title, and I'm sure you love it as well. That's why you titled your book it, and because it captures what seems to be the new approach to nutrition that yourself and many other individuals are trying to push into the mainstream, and that's focusing on whole, nutrient-dense foods and thinking of the body as a whole integrated system rather than maybe a metabolic math machine. What inspired you to title your book Whole?
Well, in the China study, if I could mention that first, that was an attempt, writing it with my son, who's a physician, by the way, writing it with him and essentially documented what I thought I had been learning in the laboratory and the research arena for the previous 4 decades or so. And so we were just simply telling, if we could, a story that makes sense, of what we had learned. And what we learned, from my perspective and my interpretation, was something substantially different than what it was when I started my career. I was a believer in a good old American diet, high in protein, fat, and all the rest of it. But what we really learned was that a diet that's much lower in protein, lower in fat, whole plant-based foods was where it's at and where we could gain the greatest health. And some of these effects were really remarkable. So that was a China study. But what we didn't answer, at least when I finished writing the book, I realized what we didn't answer was why has this kind of information sort of been hidden, in a sense, in the dark corners of our minds. And it really wasn't that well known. It's not taught in medical schools. In fact, nutrition is not even taught in medical school. So I ended up with as many questions as I did answers by the time we got done with the China study. And I wanted to write another book to see if I could address this question, why nutrition has been so confusing for so many people, why we, as I say, push in the background as far as the practice of medicine is concerned and things like that. And so the idea that I basically had been evolving for many years and finally wrote it down was just having a look at the way the body works, starting with the cell. I mean, we've got more than 10 trillion cells in our body, and being a biochemist as I was also, I became really fascinated with what each cell is. It's like a universe, essentially. If you consider the relative distance between things, it's about like looking at the universe we know. And at the same time, it's an extraordinarily complex thing a cell is, and yet at the same time, in spite of this complexity, the integration of activities is just beyond comprehension. And so we see this with a single cell, then you start building it up and finally get to the whole body. This idea of looking at complexity on the one hand, yet looking at simplicity on the other in terms of the way and the efficiency with which the body works, it was obviously apparent to me that it's the whole system that works together, and all the different parts are communicating with each other, and they depend on each other. And that was the concept of the whole idea. And in fact, that's really the definition of nutrition. We have, for far too long, been spending time, and we still do today, thinking nutrition is all about individual nutrients or individual mechanisms by which they work or individual diseases, that might be affected or other health events. And so we think in this very reductionist way, and that's the way we do science. That's the way I did science. In fact, much of my career was working on one thing at a time, if you will. And so the real effect, the most exciting effects is when you allow things to work together as they were arranged by nature, if you will. And when it's done that way, and of course we choose the right kind of foods, amazing things happen. we can cure heart disease. We can basically cure diabetes type 2 at least, and have these. And we in our laboratory, we were able to reverse cancer, turn it on and off through nutritional means. That at the time was a reductionist idea initially, but eventually it turned out to be a very holistic idea. And so I think this idea of thinking holistically about what nutrition can do is, in my mind, offers tremendous opportunity to sort of, in a sense, to tell us, if we think this way, we can actually make great gains in terms of making people healthy and saving on healthcare costs and all the rest of it that goes with it.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Dr. Campbell, in describing and using the word opportunity, because it seems like by focusing on whole, nutrient-rich foods, in fact, that seems to be, I know there's a lot of debate, obviously, there's always been debate in the nutritional community, but it seems like everyone, at least maybe not Coca-Cola or Unilever, but non-corporate interests, all seem to agree that the key is getting back to whole, nutrient-dense things that we find directly occurring in nature. And why do you think that approach is becoming so popular so quickly over the past decade?
Well, actually, I think you're a little optimistic. From my perspective, I didn't know it had become so popular so quickly. I'm certainly hopeful, that we'll begin to think that way. And I do know, more people are talking about it for sure. I'd like to see more progress, obviously, to be honest about it. But the fact of the matter is it works. It simply works. And what my son Tom and I said in the China study at that time was, by the time we got done writing the book, I offered to the reader the idea, essentially, they didn't, the information, the data, if you will, is very, very complex and complicated oftentimes, sometimes controversial, obviously. And I just basically said to the reader, you don't have to believe me, just try it. Mm-hmm. Well, that was, it turned out that subsequent to that, and that was 9 years ago, almost 9 years ago, and since then I've given 500 lectures in most of the med schools, and I'm running into so many people who just try it, and the breadth of effect in terms of affecting various sundry diseases that otherwise might be present or are going to occur. The breadth of effect is just, it's incredible. And the rapidity with which the response actually occurs. And so compare this, that's food, with, let's say, the alternative, what we're now doing. It's basically relying on drugs. If we took the best of all the drugs and put them together somehow, it couldn't come close to touching what nutrition can do when it's done the right way. And so it's really strange, bizarre diseases, let's say, that for which we don't know what the answer is, and we call them idiopathic, if you will, and names of that sort. It turns out that when you start doing this, people get rid of aches and pains and just to mention some things straight off, and colds and flus and the serious diseases, obviously.
Well, and Dr. Campbell, the thing that is, again, I see the same thing, and it's this: just try eating whole, natural foods, and you'll be shocked at the medical improvements in these seemingly autoimmune or idiopathic diseases, which are otherwise untreatable via traditional means. What the thing that is always so fascinating to me, and I'd love to get your take on it, is certainly you have been the brunt of some let's say critiques and
saying it very mildly.
and at the core, especially like with the new book here, I hear two very distinct messages. I hear, don't eat processed garbage, eat nutrient density, and eat whole natural foods. And in fact, that message seems to be very much reflected by some of your key opponents in the Paleolithic or paleo or primal community. Like that core underlying message, and by doing that, by focus on natural nutrient density sources of calories, you can cure disease and live better, and just stop eating processed garbage. You can live better. That seems to be the foundation of both movements. If that's true, why does there seem to be such a either or between those two movements?
Well, I think, just in my own impression, and I've had some interaction with the paleo folks, and that is that whereas, yes, they do offer the idea that eating whole plant-based foods is not a bad idea, it's a good idea. Even some of the people, the Atkins-type enthusiasts, if you will, have said that too as well. And so just sort of standing back just for a second and reflecting on this, I see food as being sort of, in a sense, in three categories. One is animal-based, the other is plant-based, and the third one is the processed foods, of course. And so if you can look at the processed foods, for example, we find a lot of problems with it. It's just too high in salt, sugar, and fats, not good. If you look at the animal foods, got problems too, really serious problems. And so I could spend all day long talking about the negatives of those two groups of food, and I would prefer not to. I'd like to give positive. So that's why I say whole plant-based foods, because plant-based foods is where it's at, and the closer we get to it, to that kind of diet, the healthier we're going to be. The paleo approach, in fact, whereas it doesn't aggressively promote, let's say, the consumption of animal-based foods, they allow for the fact that you can basically consume as much as you like. I mean, it is basically a low-carb kind of derivative in a sense. And so, and I do not agree with that. And so, we can agree on some common ground here that, the processed foods are problems, obviously. But as to whole foods, I don't see us eating whole animal foods very readily. Certainly not raw, which some of them want to promote. And it doesn't make sense. And, the protein content, if we allow ourselves to continue to believe that protein is so important, and of course most of our protein from animal-based foods, that's going to shut down or at least decrease substantially the consumption of plant-based foods. So I don't know. I'm not terribly comfortable.
Well, Dr. Campbell,
that we.
Well, what I hear you saying, which I love, and when I had the great fortune of talking to, I think, one of your professional friends, Dr. Joel Furman, he also echoed, was the importance of a whole nutrient-dense foods and this idea of opportunity cost, where if we're allowing less nutrient-dense or nutrient-poor foods crowd out more nutrient-dense foods, that's certainly not good. And that's what I hear you saying, that there's some concern that if individuals were to eat non-nutrient dense, but still non-processed animal foods, that would be less beneficial than eating the most nutrient-dense foods. Is that fair?
Yes, it is very similar. You said it about right. I think it reflected what I think. But I will also suggest that if we look back and look at the definition of what nutrition really is and what a nutrient is a central nutrient. And central nutrient is basically, as someone argues, both present in plants and animals, in fact. But from my perspective, having been in the field of nutrition for so long, a nutrient is the only nutrients that there really are those that we have to consume because we can't synthesize them. They're all from plants. And so I basically say that animal foods have no nutrients in them that cannot be obtained, in a better form and at more appropriate levels by consuming plants. So the nutrient-dense idea I haven't gotten too excited about either, to be honest about it, because it's kind of allows then people to think that, animal foods have lots of nutrients that are important, especially protein, if you will, or calcium and such. And that's just not true. The level of consumption of those so-called nutrients in animal foods is an inappropriate level. And to go back to the definition, as I said, the most powerful nutrients are the antioxidants, of course, the complex carbohydrates, and go to plant-based foods, and fat and protein is also the appropriate levels and right balance of minerals and so forth and so on.
Well, it's a very fascinating point, because it seems like there what I heard you say, correct me if I'm wrong, is that plants can provide all essential nutrients when
right.
If you ate a purely and properly formulated, completely vegan diet, you could obtain all essential nutrients. And certainly that has some backing. What are your thoughts on, oftentimes, and this just might be my personal experience, I have many vegan or vegetarian friends, and they take in such an abundance of non essential nutrients, aka sugars and starches, and they're just, the wheat processed into bread, even if it's whole wheat, does not seem to be particularly helpful at anything except maybe giving you diabetes. But people will be like, oh, it's plant-based, so I'm doing good. I'm listening to Dr. Campbell's advice. What would you say to those kind of people?
Well, first I would say let's not use the words vegetarian and vegan. In the China study, for example, we never used the word vegan once. And in the word vegetarian, which I think was only used about once in reference to something that I was not particularly happy with. Vegetarians, I didn't get into this because I had any particular fondness for vegetarianism in those days. In fact, I thought that movement was kind of strange, to be honest about it. But it turns out that vegetarians, about 90% of them are still using a lot of dairy and oftentimes eggs and maybe fish and so forth. So the nutrient composition of their diet, and this nutrient composition really matters, the nutrient composition of their diet is not that different from the omnivore, for example, the non-vegetarian, especially in fat and protein intake. And so you see a little bit of benefit, but not the big kind of benefits I'm talking about. Vegans, on the other hand, I just don't like to use that word. Because historically, most vegans who became vegans because of ideological reasons, it's good and sufficient. I don't want to argue with their rationing, their rationale for this, but in any case, that's not why I came to this particular point of view, because we're not talking about veganism, really, because vegans still use, just as you said, you're absolutely right. The average fat intake of the vegan diet is up around 25-30% of fat, not that different. And at the same time, these low processed foods, so the nutrient composition of the vegan diet is often poor. It really is. Mm-hmm. That's, in fact, it was for those two reasons, not wanting to say that what I was talking about was neither vegan nor vegetarian, and I was the one that actually coined the phrase plant-based diet. It was when I was working with NIH at the time on the study section, we were determining, the priorities of research activities, and I had to share with some of my friends what I was talking about, and I didn't want to use the vegan vegetarian words because it connotes kind of into some in minds of some negative experiences before you start the discussion. And so the whole food plant-based, it's an awkward set of words, obviously, but it best describes, I think, what I'm talking about. And then all of my views are really based on the science, on the evidence, not on ideology.
It certainly makes sense, and I think there's this unfortunate conflation of both. It seems on both sides of the coin, both on the individuals who do partake in animal foods and individuals who do not, where you have these low quality sources or food sources which contain very few essential nutrients. Like on the plant side, we've got our starches and our sugars, which it seems just mathematically do not even compare to things like vegetables and fruits in terms of providing a lot of what you do need and not so much of things you don't need. And then on the animal side, we've got processed, corn-fed, hormone-injected pink slime, and then we have things like wild-caught salmon. And sometimes when I'm describing eating the most of the things you need and the least of things you don't need with people, I hear them express some confusion in the sense that they're like, well, if I focus on plant foods, can I eat those things, those starches and sweets? And they don't seem to just get, it's about focusing on the quality of food. And I hear you saying that it's really important to focus on the quality of food, but are in your mind, are all plant-based things equal and all animal things equal, or do you stratify within those two categories?
No, I don't sort of partition the individual foods within the categories that much, because the really distinctive and big differences are when comparing, let's say, whole plant-based foods with animal-based foods. The nutrient composition of each of those groups is substantially different, as groups one from another. We can see within the groups, individual foods, of course, having rather substantially different concentrations of this or that or some other kind of nutrient, perhaps. But I'd like to stick to the dietary lifestyle, first off, and talk about these whole plant-based foods, some of which, of course, are going to be providing the majority of our energy needs, some of which are going to be more concentrated in the antioxidants, and as I say, it's a very important category of substances, some of which are going to be providing a lot of complex carbohydrates. They're all good, and a right balance of minerals. So, sure, you can look at tubers, for example, just to mention that tubers are very high in carbohydrate. We know that. And about maybe 98, 99% of the total energy in a tuber, like a potato or such, is going to be the complex carbohydrates. And in that category, by the way, it's true that when you look at it chemically, a potato is going to be a very starchy vegetable. So we all know that. But the starch in that particular form, as a whole food, when combined with other kinds of foods, like the antioxidant-containing foods or other sorts of foods, it's great. I mean, my diet, in terms of nutrient composition, is 80-20-20. In other words, I'm talking about a diet that approaches something like 75-80% total carbohydrate. And much of that, if we look at it chemically, is going to be called starch. And so, I think starch has taken a bad rap in some ways because, it's often consumed out of the context of whole food. And it does lead a little bit to a higher hyperglycemic response, maybe, than some other things. And when it's done that way, you can always sort of put your finger on a few things that aren't exactly what you like. But if you eat in the whole food and mix and match all of them, you can forget about those crazy ideas. You don't even need to think about, the detailed information of exactly how much of this nutrient, how much of that, and anything else. It just so happens that you end up consuming a diet that has approximately the right amount of protein, the right amount of fat, the right balance of minerals, and of course, the right vitamins, complex carbohydrates, and the rest of it.
Well, Dr. Campbell, go ahead.
I don't get too excited. I've tried to make a point of that whole. That one of the things that got me into this idea too was that in science we tend to want to measure things very precisely. We tend to want, and that's what science encourages. We tend to actually want to know the chemical identities of things. We want to know exactly how they function. I mean, I taught this in upper level nutrition classes for years, and I did the same thing. But then when you start looking at the numbers a little more carefully, what do these numbers really mean? What do these individual identities mean? Well, they end up getting translated into, let's say, nutrient supplements, and they get translated into dosages of an exact amount. And that's crazy. That's what science has become, unfortunately, and I'm kind of a critic of science, and my own science, actually, that I've come to know, because I think the concept of holistic, sort of concepts is one where we tend to pay less attention to the numbers, to the densities and things like that, and just go with the flow as far as what nature provided.
Well, and two interesting points, Dr. Campbell, that you've said this twice, and I love it. You said, go with the guidance that nature provided, and earlier in our conversation you said, as arranged by nature. And I think some individuals may get hung up on the fact that, based on our teeth, based on the fact that humans are naturally omnivorous creatures, going with the flow in nature would entail things like if you could eat grass-fed beef liver and wild-caught salmon, that would be acceptable. So, is there a paradox there where if we go with the flow of nature that includes whole nutrient-dense plant foods and whole nutrient-dense animal foods, and to do anything different, is that still in the flow of nature?
Well, I don't think it was really in the flow of nature for us as one species to basically be carnivorous. I mean, sure, there were some animal-based foods that have been consumed. I think most people would agree with that, some of that in our distant past. But at the same time, our nearest living primate relative is only consuming between somewhere around 3, 4, 5% or so of animal-based food. Most of that is insects. So I know there's been a big thing mentioned for people who feel very passionately about this, that we were hunter-gatherers. I think we were more gatherer-hunters than hunter-gatherers. I don't need to say that that we can't allow for some consumption obviously, of the animal-based kingdom. But on the other hand, I just don't buy the argument that somehow we know for certain that we were consuming large amounts of animal-based food in our past. I don't think we were. I mean, I've met a lot of paleontologists too who will argue that we didn't do that. And the arm of the human species that drifted northward, namely the Neanderthals, for example, they did get into more of the meat. So I understand it. I'm not a paleontologist or an archaeologist by any means, but just reading the literature, they did get into more of the animal kind because they were living in the far north, where they sort of had to with the winter climates. But the ones that the Homo sapiens, who was more or less in the equatorial part of the world and the subtropical and even the temperate zones, they could easily live, and they still do to a great extent, live on just plant-based foods. I don't like to make my argument on the basis of that because I'm getting out of water. This is not my territory. I'm really talking about it. I'd rather prefer to talk about the evidence that I know from a biochemical perspective. And from the biochemical perspective, and this is the one story I haven't been able to tell, because a person has to be a little bit trained in biochemistry to understand this. But when we go inside of the cell and we see this just incredible complexity of reactions, biochemical reactions, and we understand how enzymes, for example, can catalyze and control the reaction rate forward and backward for all these things, and this marvelous way of enzymes being able to change and be able to do that, all the feedback loops and things like that. You can go through and look at all these reactions and ask yourself, as you go through these reactions systematically, the body in the cell, in this particular case, is always trying to create health. They're trying to maintain life, as they go, and then they'll reproduce themselves, and the daughter cells do the same thing. And so the direction of each of the reactions, when it's going in a certain direction, it basically points to health. And when you just allow the cell to do what it wants to do, it goes towards health. And the substances that are used from the outside of the body to propel it in the forward direction are plant-based materials. They're the nutrients from plants. And so you got this marvelous collection of just almost infinite varieties and numbers of different kind of chemicals in plants that, to the extent that they impact, the reactions within the cell, and particularly the enzyme activities that control those reactions. When you look at it from that perspective, it's so overwhelmingly, massively, the evidence is massively in favor of consuming plant-based foods. In fact, that's where I really started getting into that whole idea, because I was raised on a farm, as you probably know, and milking cows and all the rest of it, and I was teaching, to the contrary, at the beginning part of my career. But when we really started to get into the basic science and doing original research and trying to understand, what makes reactions go this way or that way, and how enzymes work, and how all of that relates in terms to disease formation or the maintenance of health, it becomes just abundantly clear that we were largely a plant-based species. It really overwhelms any arguments to the contrary about, let's say, our anatomical features. And some will argue, we had canine teeth, and we don't have canine teeth, I can tell you, like as you all know, like the feline species, or the cats and to some extent the dogs. We don't have those kind of anatomical features.
Well, certainly.
So
certainly it seems that there is a overwhelming amount of evidence that consuming a high proportion of our food from things like vegetables and fruits just has such a dramatic impact on health that I know of my personal experience and everything I write about, certainly eating the vast majority of your plate being non-starchy vegetables seems like it, and it seems like the science supports it, is the single most important thing we can do for our health. And I'm curious, Dr. Campbell, one thing that you mentioned, we have these essential nutrients and then we have non-essential nutrients, and those non-essential nutrients are often things we just need in order to fuel our bodies, such as maybe carbohydrate or fat, since our body can metabolize both. What would be your thoughts on an individual who, let's say, ate a plant-based whole foods diet, but got the majority of their calories from fibrous whole food plant fats, such as avocados, cocoa, and coconut. Like, what if they were getting, because those are very calorically dense foods, but they're also very high in essential nutrients and other phytochemicals. What if they were eating a large portion of their calories from those types of foods?
Well, I would find that somewhat problematic. I'm not sure that people do subsist on diets largely made up of, let's say, avocados or coconuts or nuts, if you will, all of which are, as you know, are quite high in fat. On the one hand, on the other hand, I believe that all of those foods can be consumed. I hate to use the word moderation, but I think we all know what that sort of means. And the interesting thing about those foods that are high in fat that some warn against, which I don't, in any case, the fat that is stored in those foods, especially the case of nuts, for example, the plant actually, when it was forming seeds as well as the nuts, was actually, well, nuts in particular, they were basically saving up a lot of energy, ready to go, in a sense, with the next generation of plants. And so they stored it as fat, the nuts did. They stored this energy as fat. And that fat, in turn, has a certain composition to it. And it also has a tendency over time to become rancid, oxidized. You know that, too, because it's the chemical structure of fats. But what nature did, I'm speaking almost like a teleological believer, but not quite. But what was accomplished was that they actually stored a lot of antioxidants with those fats. And I think it's not coincidental that nuts, for example, have quite a lot of vitamin E in it, for example. It's a good source of vitamin E. And so these antioxidants are stored with the fats in order to protect it. So, again, it's going back to nature, and even for the high fat or high oil kinds of plant foods, and asking the question whether we should consume them or not, I see nothing wrong with consuming some of those foods as long as they're in moderation, because when we're consuming the fat in that form, we're getting the complex carbohydrates to come along with it. We're getting lots of antioxidants, and also times we're getting a good supply and the right balance of minerals. And so I don't see anything wrong with that. People tend to want to argue this is this food is good food, this bad food kind of thing. But I eat nuts myself.
Well, I love the point you made there about the people want to argue about this versus that. And one thing that I loved about the title of your new book is, we've already talked about it, it's called Whole, and it obviously then has the connotation of focusing on eating whole foods. What is your what is your thought? It seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the single worst, and this also seems supported by the data in the wonderful Cornell Oxford project, is that these processed non-foods and things like beer and cigarettes, just these edible substances that come along with a Western diet are certainly terrible. And basically, if you could eat food instead of eating those, you would be dramatically healthier. And what are your thoughts on, because right now it seems that there is so much time spent on arguing which foods are good and which foods are bad, when we all agree that non-foods are bad, and that still makes up the vast majority of the Western diet. Like, do you think there's anything to be gained by us stopping arguing about which actual foods are good versus bad and saying non-foods are the worst? Let's unite on not eating those, and then if you want to go a level deeper, we can go from there. What do you think?
Well, that's not a bad idea. I mean, I rather like it. It requires a fairly careful definition for what is a non-food. How do you decide?
Well, let's say you couldn't find it in nature. Let's say it's not available in nature.
Okay. In other words, something synthetic, processed, if you will.
Yeah, something that requires anything more than like cutting or cooking, basically.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a reasonably good thought. I can go along with that. And I don't want to eat non-foods. I want to eat food. And for me, food is really whole, if you will. Obviously, that's nature packaged it all together and worked on it for a few million years, I might add. So, in the natural laboratory, it took a long time for all these arrangements to be put together as they have been. And that sound of that phone doesn't bother you, but
no, so that's a non-food sound. See, in nature, you wouldn't hear.
Yeah, that's a non-food sound. Yeah, right. So I mean, okay, we're on the common ground there on that one on the non-food thing. I don't think. At the same time, I have to say I'm not I may sound like a purist to a lot of people, and the way I like to say it. That whole food, plant-based diet for me is the goal. I like the word goal. It's not. I don't want to just come down really hard-nosed about this. It's the goal to reach for, and the closer we get to it, the healthier we're going to be. And I honor the step that everyone takes as they approach that goal. And one of the reasons I set that as a goal is not just because of the empirical data that I'm familiar with, and also the sort of the biochemical, if you will. But it's also the fact that once we get there, our taste preferences change. That's a big deal. That is a really big deal. It's not been talked about very much. And that is to say that when we're consuming the typical American diet, high in fat, salt, and sugar, that at least for salt and for fat, there's pretty good evidence in this in the literature. We get addicted to those things, and to the extent that we demand them, and we consume ever higher quantities. And so there's been some research to show that when people switch from a high-fat or high-salt type of diet to what should be the normal one, that's normally provided by plant-based foods, that it may take a month or two or so. We basically get rid of that addiction. I mean, it really is a physiological addiction response. And so once you get past that, then you can taste it. You have some new tastes, and they're lovely. It's just a different experience.
Absolutely, and I would add to that list, because the research is certainly as compelling. We talked about the three things that food manufacturers like to subjugate us with, and you mentioned fat and salt. Certainly, it's processed unnatural fats and unnatural salts, and then also sugar, right? Because
of course
we do not become addicted to fruits, and
right.
when they're in the whole package. But But what, Dr. Campbell? I know so much of the conversation nowadays is a bit like you have these people who understand that food is really where it's at. As you said, as arranged by nature, it's about food. And the more we can eat food, the better off we'll be. The less food we eat, the more non-food we eat, the worse off we'll be. So much time is spent basically on the which is the best food debate, that the other 99% of the population that's still getting 60% of their calories from non-food is just like, I'm confused, I'm going to step away. Like, do you think there's a future where we just say, okay, stop, eat food? Like, let's all just agree that like these manufactured processed sugars and these trans fats and these just until it's like smoking. Like, until we can get people to understand that smoking is bad for you, nothing else really matters. So, I mean, do you think there's a future where we can see like a Paleolithic type person and a T. Colin Campbell like joining forces to say, eat food first? And once you do that, we can talk, but do that first. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I like the debate. I don't shy away from the debate at all. And I'll make my case for what I tend to believe, and if others, want to tweak it a little bit and say it a little bit differently, that's fine too, and we'll keep on working toward that end. I think the key that really has been missing in our narrative is the fact that nutrition, as a subject, as a discipline, as a scientific discipline, the subject of nutrition, although much discussed by the public, and the public's very interested in this concept, what is nutrition, of course, the problem is the professions don't take it seriously. Medical schools don't teach nutrition as a discipline. There's not a school in the country that really teaches nutrition adequately. There's a few that have an elective course of nutrition and maybe, some hours, 10, 20, 30 hours or something. That's really nothing compared to get a good training in nutrition. So the first thing we need to do is to acknowledge the fact that nutrition is a very powerful natural force, if you will. It's a really interesting concept. Let's teach it, number one. Number two, let's also say that the government needs to get a little busy and acknowledge the fact that nutrition is that important. And as far as policy is concerned, they need to understand, really what they're doing. I speak from firsthand experience on that because I spent about 20 years involved in the development of national policy, in the Arab diet and health policy, and I know that inside of that like the back of my hand, I guess. And I saw, in fact, and it still works, that the effect of the corporate sector, the food industry, the drug industry, both, and the medical industry, they're trying to protect their interest. And so much of the information that the public gets really is coming from those sectors. It's not coming from, a considerate discussion, of what really is nutrition. And it's not taught in medical schools either. So the public, unfortunately, is the unwitting victims of this massive lack of good information. It's terrible. And our book, Whole, I could have gone down that track and told about the whole lifetime of experiences I've had, with, let's say, the corporate sector or even the government, the role they play in it too. And it's been a very negative sort of expose of stuff. And I don't particularly want to do that. I'd rather talk about, the positive ideas and then try to figure out, how all of us as a society, whether we're professionals or not, is there some kind of narrative that we can kind of agree on? And I think that the concept of whole is really where it's at, which in turn that's what nutrition is. Nutrition is a holistic science. Pharmacology is a reductionist science, one thing at a time. A lot of people want to turn nutrition into a reductionist science, and that's what's happening. A lot of it, make nutrient supplements, and they don't work, and things like that. But, I'm sorry for this really long answer, but I think if we could just agree to have a civil discussion, about the facts and not get caught up in trying to protect some particular industry, or even, for that matter, protecting our cultural past.
Well, absolutely. Well, certainly, Dr. Campbell, I think the listeners can, and I personally appreciate a lot of what you just said in terms of government needing to get involved here, us needing to think about nutrition as a viable path in medicine. The fact that that's even being discussed to me seems almost disgusting because it seems so obviously true that I don't, and it seems like there then is this need for a unity because of those things you just discussed. It's like everybody who isn't in those, who doesn't have a vested interest in the status quo continuing, agrees. And I would just, I crave the day when we can all come together, everyone who believes in the power of nutrition. Maybe we don't have the same beliefs about how to get, it's almost like religion in some sense, right? It's like we all kind of agree that you shouldn't kill people and that lying is probably not optimal. So let's just all work together to help anyone, any corporation, any major entity that is doing these things which are just unambiguously bad. I crave the day when we can focus on combating that and combating these billboards I see all around my home now, which says Coca-Cola, it's only 140 calories a can. Both you and the Mark Sisson or Lauren Cordain of the world would find so many problems with that, but yet that's
where I do too. Yeah,
their information.
Right, absolutely.
So it's anyway, I don't know. Maybe someday we can create a "We Are the World" kind of video and unite around those kind of things.
Right. Find a common ground.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Dr. Campbell, I know you're a very busy man, and we've gone over our time here, so I just want to thank you again for sharing your time with us today. And folks, obviously there's no shortage of information out there. Dr. Campbell's book, The China Study, has sold so many copies. They probably lost track by now, so check that out. And also check out...
Actually, it's well over 1 million now. That's what they tell me.
Oh, goodness. Well, congratulations. That's amazing. And his new book, Whole, is out. And certainly he's got his foundation, which you can learn more about at tcolincampbell.org. And while Dr. Campbell and myself may not agree on everything, as we talked about here, certainly these key things, the things that are killing our friends and family, which is eating too much non-food and not eating enough food, we agree on.
Right, absolutely.
Dr. Campbell, I so appreciated your time today. I will follow up an email afterwards because I'd love to have you back on the show, and I wish you a wonderful week.
Thank you for having me.